I'm very pleased to welcome and to introduce Gerrit Trapp-Müller, who comes to us from Utrecht University, where he studied with Jack Middelburg and Appy Sluijs. Sluijs. Sorry, I totally heard that one. I don't speak Dutch. And in any case, I met Gerrit a couple of years ago when he contacted me and wanted to come and discuss a process we refer to as reverse weathering and the history of our studies of reverse weathering and the work of my students and myself over a number of decades on that topic. And he'll develop it for you today, I think, in a larger context. But it was really a wonderful meeting for me. He's incredibly enthusiastic, knowledgeable in this area, and also scholarly, which is it was really stimulating for me to meet him. And I feel blessed to have him subsequently come here as a postdoc to work with me and with Qingzhi on our project looking at early diagenetic processes. What else? I need to tell you something about Gerrit. And he's from the Eifel region of Western Germany, which is a beautiful region with, as they describe, not only wonderful geology, which stimulated him and has some of the characteristics are quaternary volcanism, for instance, which he's looked at, and ancient ocean margin deposits from that region, which got him working on landform modifications and the geology and geochemistry of those kinds of terrains. It's also characterized by what are known as fairy tale-like villages. So I hope the fairy tale part of your heritage will not come too strongly into your talk here today. He did study at Bonn, University of Bonn in Germany, and worked a lot during that period on the petrology and mineralogy of rocks and sediments, the geochemistry, and he worked with Thorsten Geisler on these topics, and he's an expert on spectroscopic methods of studying rocks and minerals. He, as I mentioned, he did his PhD at the University of Utrecht. He's also quite engaged with teaching, actually, over his career, and so I hope that will come through as he teaches us about some of these new and evolving concepts, because this whole topic is very much evolving now in our understanding of what controls the elemental cycle of the ocean. So, welcome, Gerrit. Take it away.
Can you hear me? Okay. Perfect. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bob. That was very nice. Good to hear. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here and a wonderful opportunity to tell you about Earth's Weathering Continuum, which is a concept on the role of Terrigenous marine sediments in the global biogeochemical cycles that we have developed together during my PhD in Utrecht, also together with this work. No, it's not. But it doesn't matter. That I've been working with all those wonderful people that I've listed here that really helped us shaping these ideas. Yeah, but before we start, what is this book? Okay, before we start right into it, here's a short reminder on ocean alkalinity, and I promise after that it's going to be a bit more fun. So according to one definition, alkalinity is the excess of bases over acids. And in seawater, it's usually dominated by the carbonic acid system, some contribution of the boric acid system as well. But in marine sediments, there might be a lot of other ions involved, as shown in the graph on the right here. Alkalinity controls the buffer capacity of the ocean. And so that is its ability to resist acidification. And therefore, it's really important for marine life, but also for humans. And because of this effect on acid-base chemistry and the exchange of CO2 with the atmosphere, that's also really important for carbon cycling and in determining atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And so changes in ocean alkalinity and carbon cycle are usually related to sort of biogeochemical reactions, which can be very complicated and involve a lot of different solutes and particles. And the impact of a specific reaction on alkalinity can simply be figured out by establishing the reaction balances, doing the mass and charge balances. And then cations become an interesting tracer of alkalinity changes, because if you change the conservative cation content, then you also change sort of the baseline situation, and all these bases into the cloud there would re-equilibrate with this new baseline situation, so to say. And very often, but not always, you have the case that dissolution, adding cations on anaerobic respiration, often adding bases, increases alkalinity, while precipitation and aerobic respiration have the opposite effect, so they consume alkalinity, or you could also say they release acid. And yeah, so now with this in mind, we can jump right into the carbon cycle. This is a technical view of the long-term, so geological timescales, global carbon and alkalinity cycles, in which the main sources of CO2 to the atmosphere are volcanic degassing and oxidation of fossil carbon in rocks. This CO2 then reacts with rain and rocks to form bicarbonate in a process that we call weathering. And this weathering is really a complex coupling of different dissolution and precipitation reactions. And it also releases a lot of salts and nutrients to the ocean, which then can be taken up by organisms to form biominerals and organic matter that is eventually buried in the sediments, might be subducted, and then fuels degassing again, which closes the cycle. And the balance of these alkalinity fluxes would determine well, the ocean acid-base state, and therefore also gas exchange with the atmosphere. Now, one really important thing about this is that this rock weathering flux is climate dependent, and that gives you a stabilizing feedback. So if you have a lot of volcanic degassing or some other carbon pulses going into the system, then that would increase these atmospheric concentration, would lead to warming and often seems to accelerate hydrological cycling, and that accelerates weathering rates, and therefore you draw down this carbon and go back to your normal state, so to say. And that would be a mechanism of how the Earth system keeps relatively stable at this levels where life is possible. But it has been observed that this feedback strength actually varied over Earth's history, so it's a bit more complicated than it looks here. And well, one reason for that might be that this budget has some problems. And one of the biggest problems is that there is a mass balance gap. So if you do the numbers for the modern ocean, then the input is only half of the output, which really doesn't work out. And there might be two options or two possibilities that might solve the problem. One is that the modern measurements are not really representative for this 50,000 year timescale of this cycle. But the other option, and that is a way more exciting option, is that there are other processes that we are missing. And given this magnitude of this gap, and the fact that it's also present in multiple other elemental cycles of the major elements, for example, major cations, it is very likely that we are missing something here. And one component that has been identified really early are hydrothermal processes and ocean crust weathering. And that initially in the 80s or so, or in the 70s, seemed to resolve that problem. But subsequent investigations have shown that these fluxes are not as large as initially thought, and therefore we still, well, we're narrowing that gap, but there is still a mass balance problem here. And then the next processes that have been considered are submarine groundwater discharge, which adds a few % of what the rivers bring in. And then there are these really complex anaerobic respiration and biomineral diagenesis processes, which can both add or remove alkalinity, and quite substantial amounts of alkalinity actually, simply by exchanging sediment pore waters with the water column. However, this still doesn't solve all the problems, and we're still stuck here. And one assumption in this budget is that these rivers look somewhat like this. So this is a clear water river in Norway. It has no mud at all. It is really only delivering solutes. but we all know that most rivers look more like this, especially the large river systems. So they are really muddy, and they have a lot of suspended sediment. And the idea here is that this mud will also react in the sea to influence these budgets. And so really what we will be looking at for the rest of the presentation is what is the fate of this. So what is this sediment and what is the fate of this sediment in the ocean? How does this affect these different components and also alkalinity directly? So we start by just looking at what is this mud and where does it come in? And mud is of course a mixture of eroded rock and soil fragments. But that is not really a very satisfying answer. And so what I did is I compiled this wonderful database. It's called Sluijs. It is a global scale database of river sediment composition that is freely available. You can simply follow this QR code and you will be able to download it. It compiles hundreds of published observations, mainly on major, minor, and trace elements of these sediments. Many locations also have mineral data. There's a lot of metadata, so you know exactly what sort of data you are dealing with. And we also provide extensive documentations and some processing examples so that you know how to deal with this really complex data set and how to get from there to, for example, location-wise or basin-wise export fluxes or representative average concentrations. And yeah, the first thing that we did with this data is looking at the fluxes of detrital carbonates. Detrital carbonates are basically eroded limestone fragments, as you can see in this wonderful river in the European Alps on the right here. And they are basically made of calcium carbonate. So what we did to quantify these fluxes of these minerals is we compared this database to a lot of maps of land surface properties, hydrology, soil and rock properties, and then did some fancy statistics to get to these global and basinal fluxes. I had a lot of help from Janine Berger from the University of Hamburg, who really helped me to harmonize all these different maps. So that was a lot of GIS work. And what we did then is basically comparing the PSC values to hundreds of different other variables to see which are really the important controlling factors. And then once we have determined these factors, we could make a regression to then upscale these fluxes. And so as a result, you get this wonderful map of basinal export fluxes, PSC, where PSC concentrations are indicated by the color and PSC fluxes by the size of these dots. And at least the ones of you that have looked at other riverine export maps might notice that this pattern is quite different from what you see for all the other riverine carbon fluxes. Because usually they are really high in the tropics where you have a lot of water discharge and also organic matter and weathering happening. But here, this is a very different pattern. And that is because PSC just has different controls. So basically, if you have a lot of weathering, then you start dissolving this PSC, and so you lower concentration. If you have high erosion rates, much higher than the weathering rates, then you would erode these fragments and export them to the ocean directly. And so PSC fluxes are really high in areas that are mountainous, high erosion rates, and little water availability. So, for example, the Indus River and the Euphrates Tigris system have relatively high concentrations, and many rivers of the European Alps. There's also strong lithological control, but that coincides with this erosion control because well, most of the limestones are exposed in mountain ranges, and yeah, therefore these mountains are really the hotspots of PSC delivery. This flux has also been substantially altered by humans. Actually, we reduced it by about 50%, but mainly due to alterations of the sediment flux, not so much because of the PSC concentrations. So then the interesting part is, of course, also what happens to these detrital carbonates as they enter the ocean. There are basically two options. Either you can dissolve them or you can use them as seeds for precipitation. And this would follow sort of this reaction balance that you can see down here. And from this reaction balance, you can again see that cations are a good tracer for alkalinity fluxes because this carbonate ion is exactly balanced by the charge of that calcium ring. You might now argue that where the ocean isn't really is really supersaturated with respect to most of the carbonate minerals, and therefore this might probably not dissolve. And actually, it's been observed in some river plumes, for example, at Brazos River in Texas, that they indeed act as seeds and provoke inorganic precipitation. So that would reduce their alkalinity. But we would argue that they spend a lot more time in marine surface sediments, and these surface sediments actually produce a lot of acid through respiration and reoxidation processes, and that provokes dissolution, as Bob will be probably very happy to tell you more about. You can see on the plot on the right side that dissolution rates really increase a lot as you go to shallower areas, and so there is really a lot of potential to also dissolve this PAC despite the general supersaturation of the ocean. So if you sum that up and assume it would dissolve, then you get to fluxes of 5 teramoles of carbon per year with these 2 moles of alkalinity impact per mole of carbonate dissolution. You get something like 10 teramole equivalents of alkalinity per year, which makes 30% of the riverine influxes. So this is really a scalable alkalinity flux that might help us closing this gap. And it also implies significant fluxes of calcium and strontium, perhaps also of magnesium, but that is a lot less actually, about an order of magnitude less. Yeah, but if you now look at these concentrations here, then you might notice this are really low numbers. So most of that sediment isn't actually carbonate minerals. So let's see what else we have. In these sediments, most of it's actually clay. It is soil material that's been eroded. It's been weathered before, so it is really cation depleted material. It is silicon and aluminum rich. You also have metal oxyhydroxides, which influence the biogeochemical conditions in the ocean or in the sediments very strongly. And you have residual rock fragments in somewhat lower concentrations, such as the feldspar and the pyroxene shown here on the right side. And the interesting thing about those is that they also depend on the weathering erosion ratio on land. So if you have a lot of erosion, you have more of these rock fragments. If you have more weathering before you have erosion, then you get more of these clays and soil fragments. And that really determines how they behave in the ocean. So you might have forward or reverse weathering, which are really 2 end members. In the forward weathering case, which is the standard case that we encounter on land and during crustal weathering very often, you start with a cation-rich material and produce a cation-depleted clay, and that releases cations, salicylic acid, or other nutrients. And because of that charge balance, the CO2 is transferred into bicarbonate, so you produce alkalinity. In the reverse case, you basically really do the reverse of that. You start with this cation-poor material that is most likely produced by a previous forward weathering reaction. Could also be a biomineral, and often you have metal oxyhydroxides being involved here. They react with the cations from seawater, take them up to form cation-rich clay, and the whole charge balance reverses, and you get alkalinity consumption or CO2 production. And 2 examples of this are shown here on the right side, where you have metal oxyhydroxides in the upper case that produce a chloride, which is a magnesium iron-rich clay. And in the lower case, you have a diatom that's being replaced by a green clay. So that is also a cation-rich mineral. As I said, these are just end members. And in fact, we have more something like a continuum of weathering balances that is really determined by the reactants involved and the products that you produce here and the relative reaction rates of those. So in the alkaline end member, you would start with, for example, volcanic ashes or mafic minerals or other crustal materials, producing these materials that we typically encounter in soils, but also in many sediments, such as opal, kaolinite, or cation-poor smectites. And that really releases a lot of cations and a lot of alkalinity. So this is the forward end member, so to say. And an example of this is shown in the upper right, where you have volcanic ash forming a cation-poor zeolite mineral and producing calcite. And this calcite is actually really interesting because what it does is sequestering the alkalinity that you've released before. So in that case, you have to decide if you want to produce alkalinity or if you want to store carbon, because that's two different things. Then a more neutral case would be if you start with something like a plagioclase or other cation-rich minerals, but you also produce a cation-rich mineral such as glauconite, illite, or many magnesium clays. And in that case, you have basically an exchange of sodium and calcium for potassium and magnesium, and that sort of charge balances, and so you don't really have an alkalinity impact here. And that is shown in the on the upper left. We have an albite that's being eroded from the Andes during an inundated storm event. Then it deposited at the Peru margin in surface sediments, and then alters to this glauconitic clay. And then at the acid end of this spectrum, you start with the cation depleted materials that you produced before, or with biogenic silica or metal oxyhydroxides, and form cation-rich minerals such as chloride, many green clays, or magnesium clays. You consume cations and have therefore reverse weathering. There are again these two examples that I've shown you before, but there's also one more example, which is a lateritic clay-based rain coating that's been prioritized in the Amazon Delta. Yeah, so to bring a bit more structure into this, we set up this model where you really have these organic and inorganic components reacting together, and we can observe how reaction rates, dynamics, and also reaction balances evolve over time and through the redox sequence of organic matter degradation. I don't want to go into too much detail here. Just know that the major biogeochemical setting is set by the organic matter degradation using different terminal electron acceptors, such as, well, starting with oxygen and going through nitrate, manganese, iron, and sulfate reduction, and ending in thermogenesis. And rather than boring you with a lot of solution chemistry plots, I will just summarize the conceptual results of this. And yeah, well, this is basically the main result. It is a map of orthogenic minerals throughout this sequence of organic matter degradation. The colors in the background indicate at which organic matter degradation stage you are, and the bars indicate the different minerals with non-silicate minerals. So those that are classically considered in diagenetic models in the upper part. You can see you have a lot of different carbonates and phosphates that are stable under different conditions, and there's a little gap here under sulfate reducing conditions, because there are really pyrite outcompetes most of the other components. And the lower part is the newer part that I will focus on, but I'm going to simplify it a bit because it gives you a really nice pattern in terms of determining the reaction balances and alkalinity impacts. So at the outer end members under aerobic and really anoxic conditions, you have a good chance to produce these cation poor clays just as you do on land. There's also a good chance for more cation-rich magnesium clays, simply because seawater is very alkaline, has a lot of magnesium. But these are often associated also with cation-rich products that locally enhance magnesium levels, and that moderates the alkalinity impacts. So in that case, you would, well, you can closer to an alkalinity neutral reaction. Zeolites are really variable in terms of cation content, so they can really produce both, but you have the same issue that they where the most cation-rich zeolites are usually associated also with the weathering of cation-rich reactants. And so you have a quite a wide range that you can get at these end members, but really these cation poor clays are the most common case. And so you have a better chance of producing a forward or neutral reaction stoichiometry at these outer edges. In this inner part, so the red-orange zone, so to say, under iron reducing conditions, you get green clays, and these are iron-rich clays that have a lot of cations, a lot of potassium and magnesium. And because they are so cation-rich, they really induce a tendency to reverse weathering. And that is also related to the fact that they form often and most rapidly in regions where you have cation depleted reactants such as tropical deltas, for example. And then this gives you basically a framework to predict well, alkalinity impacts for a given setting and for a given amount of reactant input and type of reactant input. And so you can find different environments back in this plot. Beaches and permeable sediments have a lot of advection and wave action, and that resets the system very quickly. So you're more on the left side of it. In these deltaic mobile muds, which are well, extensive mud belts that extend along the river-dominated ocean margins and experience seasonal reworking. So if you do that seasonally, then you are dominated by iron reduction and for most of the time. And if you have a really stable mud, then it might actually turn anoxic, and you'll end up more on the right side of this. And yeah, we're going to look a bit more at deltaic mobile nuts in a minute. I have to drink a bit. Because these mobile muds are actually really quantitatively important and very interesting in terms of reaction dynamics. So an example of a mobile mud belt, of one really major mobile mud belt, is shown here on the right at the Amazon Delta, where you have this highly weathered river sediment coming in, and you have the marine organic matter and biominerals coming in from the other side. They are seasonally mixed and then react together for something like half a year. And what typically happens in these environments is that you have production of these green clays, as we've seen earlier. And many of you might actually know Shaylee Rahman, who has worked here before. And she actually managed to quantify the flux of biogenic silica that forms clays in these environments. And that's about 5 teramole of biogenic silica per year, which is a huge flux because it's already half of the silicon that's delivered by the rivers in the salt form. And now by knowing constraints on these reaction balances, because from the river database, we know which minerals are coming in from the diagenetic model, and thanks to a lot of POPs observations, we know what the product look like and what they are composed of. And then you can get into something like you can see down here. Do this. So you can see this here. These are just by randomly distributed reactants and products that we chose based on this. You can see there is a bit of a range that we tried out, and the result is this reaction balance. So you have cation fluxes, aluminum silicon fluxes, and alkalinity fluxes. And the net alkalinity outcome, as shown here, really depends also on your reactant pool. And in the case of these low latitude deltas, you will be really at the right end of the plot, so you remove a lot of alkalinity because your reactant pool is very cation depleted. And combining this reaction balance model with this flux of 5 teramoles of biogenic silica conversion, you can scale up the other fluxes related to this reaction. So this is shown here. And you can see that uncertainties are quite large, sometimes as large as the numbers themselves. And in the third row here, you can also see the comparison in percentage to what's derived by the rivers. And what you can notice here is that fluxes of potassium and magnesium consumption are really large, make a major fraction of what the rivers bring, and therefore there is a lot of alkalinity consumed, and a third of the alkalinity that's delivered by the rivers actually goes into this clay-forming weathering processes. Of course, deltas are not the only environment. We have a lot of other environments, as you might know very well. One that is really exciting are beaches and permeable sediments, because of all the advection and this wave action and grain collision, you have really high reaction rates that are somewhat comparable to what we find in these deltaic muds, and that also suppresses precipitation. So you have more dissolution and precipitation typically. And because many of these grains, I mean, many beaches are made of quartz almost entirely, but there are also other beaches where much of these coarse-grained materials are other lithogenic fragments, as shown by this black beach in the lower bottom here. And in that case, you would really produce a lot of alkalinity because you get a very forward reaction balance and you have high rates. Although the area of those beaches is maybe very small compared to the others, that might be some sort of hotspot situation. If you go further offshore, then you basically start decreasing reaction rates with bathymetric depth. And that is, I think, or we think that this is related to slow organic matter degradation rates, simply because you have less reactive and less organic matter coming in these environments. But it's also related to the fact that these remote environments are more stable, so they experience less physical action that can enhance weathering rates. And the reaction balances in these environments are, well, you have the full spectrum depending on where you are. If you're at an active margin where you have a lot of volcanism, then you might tend to a forward weathering balance. While if you're in some deep sea clay that receives a lot of biogenic silica, you might get a more reverse weathering balance. And so you end up with this slightly more elaborate view of the carbon cycle, where you have lots of different environments with different alkalinity impacts depending on reactants and local environmental conditions. The arrows here indicate the alkalinity fluxes. As always, blue is forward weathering, red is reverse weathering. And we also assessed these environments in a way very similar to what I've just shown you for the deltas. Yeah, and as a result of this, you get this slightly more complex alkalinity balance. There are huge uncertainties involved in this, so this really is just a conceptual model and first order estimate of the magnitude. So don't take these numbers too seriously, but they give you an impression of how important these processes might be in this cycle. And as you can see here, they might be really important to iron cycling by removing iron, but also by supplying iron to anaerobic processes. And they are also responsible for a lot of orthogenic carbonate formation in sediments. As I've mentioned earlier, this is something that stores carbon for you, which would otherwise maybe leave the sediment and would add up to ocean CO2. Yeah, we couldn't quite solve the mass balance yet, and that is probably related to the fact that we have these large errors and that we haven't considered all the environments yet. And many of these silicate weathering environments actually balance out, so there's not too much net alkalinity effect simply because you have a lot of reverse weathering environments, also a lot of forward weathering environments. And I think it will be really exciting to see how we can better quantify this and how we can identify the fluxes that are still missing. As a result, you get also this more elaborate view on how the weathering feedback works. So here I compare two extreme cases, which we've also plugged into a carbon cycle model. And the idea here is that you have a world that maximizes alkalinity production on the left side. You have a lot of mountain building, you have a lot of volcanism, sea level is relatively low, so you have freshwater dominated shelves where also this material can be reoxidized and can be dissolved. And so this, at least the silicate weathering side of things, would bring a lot of alkalinity to the ocean, while the reactions in the ocean, because you remove these deltaic hotspots, and you get, due to strong erosion, relatively cation-rich material delivered to the ocean, that would also contribute to more forward or neutral balances. On the right side, in contrast, you have basically a muted terrestrial forward weathering, and that is because if you have a very thick and impermeable soil layer building up over the rock, and the rock cannot be reached very well by the water anymore. And then in that case, really your weathering rates just drop. And the other effect is that you have mainly cation depleted materials being delivered to the ocean. If you combine that with a high sea level and with a relatively high either local biogenic silica input or generally high dissolved silica concentrations, then you get a lot of reverse weathering. So in that case, the recovery from a carbon cycle perturbation might be significantly retarded, and that these scenarios fit a lot of scenarios throughout Earth's history where we actually observed differences in weathering feedback strength, and so there might be a good explanation for how this weathering feedback is so variable. Yeah, so to conclude, considering marine sediments in addition to the normal terrestrial and oceanic cross weathering enriches our understanding of the global biogeochemical cycles. And in the ocean at least, weathering balances and rates are governed by lithogenic, pedogenic, so soil-derived, and marine biogenic particle sources by their pre-processing before they reach the environment, so in the previous environments, and by the local sedimentary conditions of that environment. And we find the highest marine weathering fluxes and rates in nearshore terrigenous sediments, like deltas, beaches, and permeable sediment, and also associated with organic matter degradation. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to me so long, and I'm looking very much forward to discuss with you.
And so, I mentioned this last week, but so we have two students that we have volunteered to ask the first two questions, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. So Fabian and Ian, I think you're on for today, so why don't you go for it?
Sure, I'll go first. So thank you for the presentation. I definitely understand that you highlighted the consideration of multiple factors. You briefly mentioned at one point in time, you mentioned the concept of seasonal reworking. Do you mind just explaining that process for me?
Yeah. So I think what really determines this seasonality is the river input. And that is, yeah, basically every half year or so, you get high river discharge, and that resuspends all the mud. So everything is mixed and is set up newly. Also, you have seasonality of the biogenic inputs, and so this is what I refer to as reworking. So they get suspended and then they settle again.
Okay. Thank you.
And that is, by the way, very interesting because it contacts all these reduced substances with this oxidized seawater. So that also produces a lot of reactions.
Yeah, hi. So when we measure like different sedimentary layers of different rocks, we make a lot of assumptions about what's in the rock, about what the world looked like at that geologic time. So would you say that because this process is so significant in the carbon cycling, do you think that maybe our previous estimates are off by quite a bit because we haven't considered this process as much?
So I think I don't understand what flux do you think is off?
Yeah, so
The terrestrial weathering flux? Or
yeah, for anything, like based on the sediment composition of when we measure different layers of sediment at different geologic times, we've made assumptions about what was happening during that time based on the components. But you've brought on that this process could be very significant in how a lot of different cycling works. And so would you think that like a lot of those estimates are far off because we haven't considered this?
well, I don't think they are too much off actually, because if you only alter a few percent of that river sediment, you already produce huge biogeochemical fluxes on that scale. So you don't need to change a lot about the sediment to get these huge fluxes. And then most of that mud will still be the original mud, basically. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Josie?
Hi, so thank you, Gerrit. We round all my lectures and reading and whatever, but one of the things I noticed early on is you had a picture of a cockalophore.
Yeah.
So what is, and as you know, there are huge blooms all the time of calcareous organisms like cockalophores in the ocean. So what is the role of these biogenic, there's organisms in the water in terms of your balances.
Yeah, that has two aspects. One is of course the biological production itself. That also has varied. That is another interesting thing that could explain some of the carbon cycle perturbations. I think Jack has written about this. I can send you a paper for one. So that is definitely also a dynamic part. So if you get more production, and especially if you get more burial of these biominerals, then that of course reduces alkalinity levels. But it also stores carbon. And the other thing is, of course, the influence of these biogenic carbonates on the sediment biogeochemistry and the products that you form in there. So what they do is they buffer acid, so they generally raise alkalinity levels and they raise pH levels, which is beneficial for clay formation. And in fact, it's been observed in a lot of different carbonate uses that you have formation of magnesium clays. Which might recycle part of the magnesium from those carbonates, but they seem to also take up magnesium from the water column, and therefore you support reverse weathering in these environments. Except for your talking about a coral reef that's on a volcanic island, for example, because then you have this wet crusted substrate that is very cation rich, and then you might neutralize that, and then you have basically a carbon storage pond.
That's a question. Or Bob, you go.
I do have a question. If you want me to go?
I don't know. You go, whatever.
Why don't you go?
All right. I feel like my question's a little bit of a left turn here, but you know, my expertise is sort of wildly different than yours, although we both like live on the same planet and probably care about some of the same things that are going on the planet. And so, you know, when I hear your talk, I think about things like this has a lot to do with patterns of acidification or sequestration or, you know, climate, like nutrient balances or something like that.
Yeah.
So, is there anything that, you know, a policymaker, a decision maker who's working in marine systems should like really hone in on, or say we need more funding for, you know, Gerrit's work, or I mean, most of what I know about this really comes from Bob last semester and then you now. So, you know, could you provide a little more context for how we interrupt these problems and maybe incentivize systems to, you know, do more sequestration or something like that?
Yeah, so I think again there are two aspects of that. I don't think we are at a stage that we know enough about this stuff to actually give good consult. But there are two aspects. One is, as I said, we substantially altered the river systems, and we have no idea, literally no idea how that impacts these reactions. So that is a really important component. The other component is our enhanced weathering solutions. I don't know if you've heard about this approach, but they basically try to dissolve cation-rich silicates in the ocean or also on farmland to produce alkalinity and therefore remove anthropogenic carbon. And for these approaches, this is really critical because that provides you information about where this can be efficient, where this could backfire, and how you could do that best, basically.
So actually, during your earlier visit here, this is not my question, it's just a comment on something you just said. We actually went out to the Conics to look at where one of these experiments regarding forward weathering enhancement is being made, in which olivine is being laid out on the beach faces there, and its reactions followed. And that would be one of the, in principle,
if you're
producing alkalinity as opposed to consuming. But that's just a comment regarding local efforts on this kind of thing that you just mentioned. So you showed a slide right at the end regarding the role of high stand of sea level in moderating some of these balances between these different land members. And at the same time, in emphasizing that role in terms of, I would guess, deltaic types of deposits that are being formed during those high stands in a very physically active region of the ocean. You also have extensive regions of shelves that are permeable sands, which you earlier made the case that they were forward weathering.
Yeah.
And you also, during these high stand periods, quite commonly in geologic history, have higher spreading rates at ocean ridges. So you're generating more fresh basaltic material exposed to seawater in that region. So although you emphasize the deltaic part during the high stand, which is a reverse weathering balance, you have this classic net gross type balance that you're facing in all these things.
Yeah.
So you enhance the forward weathering in these other two parts of the system.
Yeah.
So can you comment on that balance between forward and reverse during high stands?
Yeah, I think well, one thing is that parts of these permeable sediments, not talking about beaches here, but really talking about more stable permeable sediments, actually get iron reducing. And so you might encounter relatively alkalinity neutral weathering there. And the other thing is we simply don't have a good quantification of how they compare to each other. I mean, thanks to human shading, we have a pretty good idea of how much deltas contribute globally, at least these smaller amounts of the deltas. But really, these numbers are shown for beaches are based on some experiments where they simulate wave action and then upscale this. So I guess to figure that out in more detail, we definitely need better quantifications and also need to have a better idea of how sedimentation patterns change with sea level change. But this was just making this extreme case. And the other thing is that if you have low sea level and you still have these permeable sediments on them, they still weather, but they are weathering in fresh water. So in any case, that would be more forward, probably. Yeah, and of course, spreading this. The mid-ocean spreading is a whole different aspect of this that I hadn't touched here. It's certainly important for geological.
Could you go backwards a few slides?
How many?
3. I don't remember. 1 or 1. There. So at the bottom there says volcanic beaches. Could you say something about that? Is that important?
Yeah, I think it's very important actually, because these are these black and green beaches that I mentioned before. So they are really rich in these rich materials, basically the same materials that people want to use for these enhanced weathering approaches, but they are just naturally occurring beaches. And again, we have no idea what's the flux from these environments. So that could be really important hotspot of alkalinity generation. It could be, I don't know if it is really. Figure out. Same goes for these deep sea ashes. We don't have pretty good numbers for that. There are actually some numbers around for Eocene times, but not for the modern.
So by volcanic beach, you really mean the sediments on the beach and not necessarily hydrothermal venting.
No. This is not related to any hydrothermal action, but that is of course another interesting component of these systems.
I'll catch up with you at the barbecue.
I like that.
That's the perfect
Transition.
transition to, oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.